Hello, good morning, and thank you all for joining this webinar today. It's our pleasure to have you with us today. My name is Henry, and on behalf of the ACIOE Associates Nigeria, we want to say thank you to all of you who have found the time to join us today on this webinar. We shall be dealing with something very important today. We shall be dealing with the topic, understanding effective private sector engagement for policy advocacy. We understand that many of you have been working in the policy advocacy space, making efforts to ensure that policies are enacted and that there's a lot of social change in our society. We have gone through a number of topics previously on the different webinars that you have attended. Today is the 11th in the series of our webinars. It's our pleasure to have all of you on board. And interestingly, it's our great pleasure to have our facilitator for today, Mr. Felix Rangdong, who will be doing justice to the topic that we have. I bring you greetings from all of us at ACIOE, thanking you once again for joining us. The Scale webinar series is part of our activities on the Scale project. The Scale project is the strengthening local engagement, local advocacy engagement in Nigeria. We are doing this in partnership with Palladium and to facilitate sessions, learning sessions and activities and engagements to ensure that we improve the capacity of different local actors to improve their work in the advocacy space. This is the 11th in the series, and we're happy to have all of you on board. On behalf of the managing partner for ACIOE, I want to welcome everyone from the ACIOE team and all of you who have joined from wherever you are. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on which part of the world you are on today. Just before we go into the webinar proper, I would like to, on behalf of Palladium, we're expecting one member from Palladium to join us. They have not come at this time, so we'd like to thank all of you. We bring greetings from them. They have sent us word to thank you for being part of this. We hope that before we finish, we will have somebody who will speak from them. Thank you so much. Just before we proceed, I would like to welcome in a special way Mr. Felix, who will be joined later on during a panel discussion with Mr. Majid Dahiru. Mr. Majid Dahiru will be joining us shortly. We would like to take a webinar poll, pre-webinar poll, just before we begin to test, to find out from you, just have a pulse check with you, find out what you think about this webinar and your expectations before we proceed. And as we welcome you in, please we encourage you to use the chat box to introduce yourself, tell us where you're coming from, your name, your email. This will equally be for us an opportunity for networking, so we're expecting that you will network during this session. Please feel free to drop your names and your organization and your designation in the chat box. All right, so there's a webinar on a poll on the screen now. We would like you to take a few minutes to attempt this poll, please. Thank you, Abdul Haruna and Ahmed Ila, Buhari Habibu. We see all of you have joined in. Welcome. Please take your time to attempt the poll. We would like to know if you have previously attended a webinar on this topic and how relevant this topic is to you. And we want to know how you expect this webinar as well to improve your capacity for advocacy. Please let us know by attempting the poll. Hello, Edna. Welcome. Edna says she's representing Other Paper Advocacy Initiative. We're happy to have you, Edna. You're welcome. Chukuma Matthew Ogonna, you're welcome. Iho Tabo, Isaac Otabo, we see all of you coming in. Good morning, everyone. Ami Onyinyechi, welcome. She's representing Civil Society Legislative Advocacy Center in Abuja. Ismail Alasisi, we see you in the room. Welcome. Lawan Bako, you're welcome. Nafisa Haliru. All of you who have joined in, you're welcome. We have a webinar poll on the screen. Please take your time to attempt it. Rachel Olori, we can see you, you're welcome. And Rashid Pamtok, Samuel Ofide, welcome every one of you who have joined. Yahuza Magaji, you're welcome. Onome from the Otueroro Foundation in Benin City, you're welcome. Abiola, we can see you in the room as well. Welcome. Please take your time to attempt the poll, just a 3-question poll. Deborah Ubwa, we can see you as well. Welcome. Dara, you're welcome. Samuel Ofide, we can see you as well. You're welcome. All right, as you come in, please feel free to introduce yourself using the chat box, please. We see Engineer Abdul Haruna representing the Spinal Cord Injuries Association of Nigeria in Kano. Thank you for joining. You're welcome. Oluseshi Oleide, Private Sector Support Associates. Thank you. Again. Ismail Alasisi from Zaria, Kaduna State. Thank you for joining. All right. Thank you so much for attempting the poll. We see Deborah Ubua from, she's the Executive Director, Debbie Kauna Foundation. Deborah, you're welcome. Thank you for all of you who have joined, as we expect more people. All right, like I mentioned earlier, we have been joined by Mr. Majid Dahiru as well. Mr. Majid, thank you for joining. I'm going to briefly introduce our facilitator for today, who will take over the discussion from here. I mentioned earlier, we're dealing with a very important topic, understanding private sector, effective private sector engagement for policy advocacy, which will be taken by Mr. Felix Rangdong. I'm going to read briefly his bio. I'm serving like John the Baptist now. This is somebody whose shoes are really big, and if I have to stoop down now to tie his shoelace, I wonder if I really can. Mr. Felix is currently a public servant as the Director General of the Public-Private Partnership Agency in Jos, Plateau State. Felix is also the Chairman of the Partnership and Resource Mobilization Committee of the African Private Public-Private Partnership Network, AP3N, and a full member of the World Association of Public-Private Partnership Units and Professionals. He is avid advocate for the development of Africa by Africans with an unapologetic Pan-African mindset. So you understand why we have called him in. The entire scale project is about improving our space by ourselves. All right. Mr. Felix is equally focused and result-oriented technocrat with over 20 years of successful work experience and exposure across various private sectors, including a Big Four consulting firm, telecommunications, media and technology, retail, financial services, real estate development, event management, and hospitality industries across several countries within Africa and Europe. So if we're looking for somebody who can help us navigate the private sector space to engage effectively to deepen advocacy, I think we have looked in the right direction. Felix has been the executive director of Sarah O Events, a non-executive director of Learning Impact NG. He is a global fraud forensics consultant and chairman of the HOD Limited, City Golf Limited, Aquarium Architecture. Past roles and positions held are, he was the general secretary, the assistant general secretary of Life Coaches Association of Nigeria. Felix has equally been a member of the Domain Name Policy Committee of Nigeria Internet Registration Association and Financial Secretary of Plateau State Association, UK chapter. Mr. Felix was the first Northern Nigerian to become a certified information systems auditor in 2001 and is a certified public-private partnership practitioner with multiple project management and project finance qualifications. He also has certified competencies in life coaching, emotional intelligence, neuro-linguistic programming, emotional freedom techniques, and matrix re-imprinting, as well as problem solving and critical thinking skills. Felix is an accounting graduate from the prestigious University of Lagos, Nigeria. He is a proud Christian, married to Yewande and blessed with two lovely daughters. Would there be a better way to introduce you, Mr. Felix? Honestly, your background is very rich, and I think it suits perfectly into the conversation that we are having today. We would like to hear from your experiences and from your different engagements. Thank you, Mr. Felix, for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you so much for having me, ACION, ACIE, and Henry, thank you for the invitation and for the partners and the distinguished guests that have joined us this morning. I really want to appreciate, this time you've taken out to come and, have this conversation. I want it to be as interactive as possible. I think we're in very critical times that, the topic itself is very instrumental, as we move forward, not just even in transitioning to a new year, but I think it's very timely that this topic and the level of interest that we're seeing also is put together by this community. So thank you once again for having me. I really appreciate this, and I hope that, with the ideas and thoughts that I would share, I want this to be more of a conversation for me to just be able to share what I, have been able to observe, if I may put it that way, over, let's say, the past 1 year in terms of where we are generally as a society, both globally, regionally, and locally or nationally, as you might have it here for us here in Nigeria. So that's the context from which I want to approach this from, also understanding the community that is participating, so that I know also how effectively I should be able to direct my conversation today. So thank you once again for having me. And just before we start, just to have a feel of the room, if the host can also help with the poll. Yes, so if you can just help, just indicate which part of these sectors you operate in currently. It will be quite helpful for me to be able to contextualize and frame this presentation, which would hopefully be very brief, as I want it to be more interactive, and get questions or get better insights and to learn, especially from this community. So just help by responding to this poll, and then we can get started shortly. Good morning, welcome. Welcome, everyone. Delighted to be here today. Okay, do we have enough responses for the poll so that we can go ahead? Given that we have a very short time frame to kind of congest all the conversations that we're trying to have this morning. The host, have we gotten the responses? Can I have an idea of just the general? Okay, fantastic. So we can see that close to 70% are from the NGO of, let's put it as, yeah, the NGO community, 13% from the private sector, 13% also from the business, and about 6% from government sector, and another 6% from the others. So I get that feel, yes, we're talking about policy advocacy, so I can understand where, this community is predominantly focused towards. And we can start with the slides. Thank you so much, and I'll go into the conversation. Okay. So, understanding effective private sector engagement for policy advocacy. I think I sit in a somewhat unique space, given the fact that I've kind of flowed from, having predominantly been within the private sector, though not, from the advocacy perspective, but having operated in diverse industries within the private sector in my career. And recently, as of probably 3 years ago, having joined public sector as a head of an agency here in Plateau State, I've been able to now shift my understanding, to also see some perspective of how the setup and the framework operates within a public sector institution, as we have it as government, right? So I think with this switch, I've been able to be to kind of expand my understanding of just how each of us generally, as an ecosystem, would need to work hand in hand, for us to be able to get meaningful results going forward. So obviously, there's that concept of what we call now the public-private partnerships, right? That has become a phenomenon that is continuously growing. And so I would also quickly want, if you could just state in the chat if you are familiar with what PPP, which is called public-private partnerships, are all about, just by indication of yes or no, just to give me also a good context of the audience. And can just help me out. If you've ever heard of PPP, you have a good understanding of it, or no, none at all, it would help me also in terms of just how our conversations move forward, right? PPP, public-private partnerships. Any response? Yes, okay, so people are familiar with it, yes or no? Just a yes or no on the chat. Thank you, Solomon, I see you. Any other person? Okay, yep, thank you. Okay, so I think there's a fair number of people, of course, that would have heard the concept of PPP. So we can move on to the conversation. Next slide, please. So the highlights of this generally is to give us some background in terms of what I think is happening globally. Luckily for me, this year, not deliberately intentional, but I've been able to kind of get myself really exposed to the conversations happening at different levels. both at the international, global stage, world stage, at the regional level, and across Africa, and also at what you call in the Nigerian space. So it's good to have listened into the conversations and how things are generally evolving, and in that context is where I want to put this conversation together in terms of how I believe private sector, especially from the advocacy space, need to kind of start thinking through how for more effective results to be achieved, how relevant they are in the conversations of what we're doing today, and where I think the conversations are kind of transitioning towards with regards, especially the public-private partnership space. So this is kind of an overview of things that we would kind of touch on. I think not necessarily in the direct order as presented, but obviously the conversation would kind of flesh out in one context or the other, generally on areas that have been highlighted here. Let's go. Next slide, please. All right, so regarding our world today, I think obviously, based on where we all operate from, these are some of the realities that I think I've kind of tried to contextualize to give us some, foundation on, what has shifted, right? The world is seemingly upside down, even here in Nigeria, where we obviously have a lot of our own challenges. I think from my exposure, internationally, there's nothing as significantly different that other countries are not facing in their own different ways. But definitely it seems like the world is kind of upside down. COVID having a significant reshift or resetting of people's mindsets, and obviously it's kind of helped regions generally just withdraw, as predominantly the NGO space would see. We're aware that funding support and other types of interventions that used to readily be available have strategically started being moved away, and these are due to some of these factors. We also have a lot of as we say, global unrest, insecurity, the wars, the climate issues, and it's just generally helped now reframe, I think, what is going on globally. Things have shifted. For us in Africa especially, I think COVID also kind of brought an awakening in terms of where the intervention that was required for Africa, we didn't get the necessary support that with the global world, and that has kind of brought back a more Pan-African kind of understanding in terms of where we sit in the global space. So we see more push towards leadership, also seeing how internally we can start, just resourcing for ourselves, being more productive and being able to contribute a bit more independently of, the global dependence that has been the trend for the past years, especially in the funding space, not just from, interventions with multilaterals or bilateral aids, but also even in the financing space. We're seeing consistently now there's a shift in where, the institutions and the expectations of regional clusters or regional autonomies have to be created. And we're also seeing that even cascade locally here, even within Nigeria, where from the federal, we're seeing states become a bit more autonomous and independent of the federal. And so you see all those things cascading. So it's very important for the private sector to understand these shifts that are happening globally, and to be able to align or reframe their own goals towards seeing how there's some form of collaborations and connections with these global shifts, so that you continuously be relevant in what is happening on this space, both at the global regional at Africa level, and also at the very local level within the national context. Can go to the next slide. So within the public sector, so I would, as I said, sitting at and seeing it from a different perspective here in the public sector, obviously there's a huge constraint that we now face, especially within local governments, national governments, regional governments, and the likes, So, and in our conversation regarding policy advocacy, which just for us to be on the same page, we would define here as negotiating and mediating a dialogue through which influential networks or opinion leaders and ultimately decision makers, which is predominantly government and the public sector or political interest groups or stakeholders, take ownership of the ideas the private sector are proposing, and take it up and act upon them in a positive way, right? So states, governments, nationally, we've seen our president, traveling out, India, Dubai, and the likes, are trying to also attract investments into, our into our own economy, and why is this the approach, right, from the public sector? Is because, things are really, really different from how governance used to be, in terms of just the general lack of productivity, the general lack of, resources that used to readily be available, right? And maybe just more of really, learning how to manage these resources effectively. And so this has generally impacted on, the public sector. And in that sense, where there's this constraints and limitations, I believe also for the private sector, most especially, this also presents the opportunity, because at the end of the day, the general ecosystem or community is looking to ways to which they can address core issues and fundamental problems affecting each and every one of us living within this climate or space which we all operate, whether you're on the public or private side, whether you're on the state or federal, or a regional. At the end of the day, we're all within the same ecosystem. So this is giving the opportunity for a private sector to start, engaging these conversations a bit more strategically. I think the public sector is opening up in terms of, right, because of the limited resources within, opening up with the ideas for which, where support can be rendered, for meaningful results to be able to be achieved. Let's move to the next slide. So this is kind of what I think, this gives a good picture of what we consider as an ecosystem, within any community or cluster, right? Whether it's at the local, state, or federal or regional, right, level. And in the PPP space, there's even the growth to which there's the philanthropy element that is now being considered and included as the fourth P that is now part of the conversation, right? And it's been, obviously, these are new frameworks that are still being developed and being tried to be understood in terms of how this kind of consensus between each stakeholder within these ecosystems can operate effectively for meaningful results, targeting obviously people and planet. We're looking at, obviously the impact on our lives and livelihoods, and of course, the impact on climate when we have, the planet as it is, right? So these are the deliberate and intentional conversations that are happening at the highest level, globally, regionally, and even at the state level, right? In the PPP space, what we call the public-private partnership space, and the NGO or civil society organizations are considerably now also being, brought into the fray in terms of having a critical role to play in these conversations and seeing how, all the interests, can pretty much be aligned, for us to be able to have this social economy that is holistic and beneficial based on each and every agenda and policy, right? Alignment that, the ecosystem can work from. So the private sector here would be considered as both, not just, from businesses and, and organizations, but also like civil societies, and also, the goals and intentions for which, they want impact, for the communities for which they serve. And so this ecosystem is quite the picture, that I think it's very instrumental that we see in terms of where the conversation is opening up with, especially within the private sector, to within the public sector for, more and more engagement. And that's how I see, for agencies like mine, the PPP, community, right? It's now continuously expanding, as we'll see in further slides. But let's move on to the next slide so that I'll also explain that one of the key things that needs to happen. Next slide, please. One of the key things that also needs to happen is that in every aspect of our conversation here, I think a great work has already been done at the UN level, in terms of coming up with these sustainable development goals. And they're quite succinct in terms of just being able to help, whether the private sector or public sector, align what priorities or what policies, are kind of limiting or needing attention, within their different clusters, right, and regional spaces, and the last addition to this, which is part of what we're talking about today, is the partnerships for goals, which is pretty much what we're talking about, PPP, right? Because that was the last addition to the SDGs, because they understood also that it was instrumental that, even as these SDGs were developed in these very key clusters as a focal point of what is needed for a sustainable development environment or nation, that it couldn't be achieved in any way solely by the governments or public sector, and hence, the importance of where even, especially not just the financing of it, or funding of it, which is estimated to be about 2/3 of what is required, that will be coming from the private sector. But it's not just the private sector from a financial aspect, but also in every other aspects of where, I think the private sector is instrumentally stronger than the institutions that we have within the public sector. So the SDGs, as we talk about the policies, need to be clearly aligned, to SDG goals. At the turn of the, in the last, as at 1999, the conversation around PPP was pretty much very, very scanty. And just to give some context and definition, is just an agreement between, the public side, government, and, the private sector now, as private sector would also include civil society organizations or the philanthropic institutions as part of what is considered as private sector, but coming together, right? And, to initially focus on predominantly infrastructure. Infrastructural development, and we're talking as of that time predominantly hard infrastructure like your roads, your bridges, your airports, and all those kind of hard infrastructure. But over time, as the years have evolved, the needs have continued to grow in terms of we as humans being social beings and evolving. The shifts in this space also continuously, we're seeing a very, very quick, just like we're having with technology. So there's a very, very quick shift in terms of how the PPP space is evolving. And as we see in the next slide now, as of 2 years ago, we can see that everybody, pretty much, this was as of 2021, but even in Africa, as you're looking, there are much more as of 2023 now. I can assure you, pretty much the whole of Africa is covered also in red in terms of everybody adopting, what is considered this public-private partnership as a model for development, as a model for progress, as a model for, the way forward. Because obviously constraints from the public side is enormous in terms of not just resources, but, even the capacity, especially also in understanding how this evolution and these quick human needs are evolving. And of course, the instrumental flexibility that the private sector offers, not just from insights, efficiency, and focus, but the alignment of the two within an ecosystem, appreciating that most importantly, that we all operate within the same ecosystem, and we're being able to kind of outline and frame our roles within the same ecosystem so that each and every objectives for each of us as institutions or entities can be achieved. There's this harmony that needs to happen at a very, very foundational and instrumental stage. So this is a marriage pretty much that is happening. This is the global shift and mindset that is happening. Even communities like the Arab nations, the Saudi Arabias, the UAE, that is very significantly, in terms of resource rich, funny enough, have shifted and still, even within their public sector, have adopted the PPP as a framework for development, even within their own communities, as advanced and as, developed as they have been. So these are the general conversations that's happening, and especially for this community that I'm speaking to, in terms of the philanthropic element of it, in terms of where the conversations are going, there's also a role that is instrumental, because what we're talking about here is about how do we partner, right, within these ecosystems? How do we come together that each interest group is fully represented, our goals, and, the simplicity of it is looking at it, like, a real life marriage, because these relationships or these kind of programs or projects that are entered into in the PPP frameworks are usually very long term. So it's an aspect that how do we identify, key, alignment clusters that would be beneficial to each and every one of us. And this is, just from this background, I'll kind of share and break down what I think is an approach that we should be able to kind of consider and adopt going forward, from this base, overview that I've given. Let's go on. Next slide, please. Okay. So now, in terms of framing, I think we've looked at, in the private sector, in operating within, as I always would refer to it, as an ecosystem, meaning, let me give an example of here as a state, it's a state is a geographical region, and of course we have different players and interest groups that are operating within this ecosystem. So that's how I've kind of tried to frame it for us to understand. So within this geographical region, whether it's national, state, local, or regional, for governments in terms of public sector, the structure of where the MDAs, what you call the ministries, departments, and agencies, kind of are framed in this, clusters of where we're talking about the delivery of infrastructure or regulation of infrastructure, or the regulation or delivery of, wealth creation mechanisms, and, where you guys predominantly in the NGO space would fit, social and human capital development clusters, right? So you have all your ministries, departments, or agencies kind of focused in these areas. And I believe it's very important now, and I think it's something that obviously, has been done in the past regarding policy advocacy, to focus clearly in terms of how do we align, right, as a private sector entities to, some of these, specific, institutions and of governance that kind of give clear value propositions of each of these entities or each of these clusters being, developed or advanced or improved upon from where we are currently. And obviously, as an agency, we just kind of sit where we kind of help mediate this conversation in terms of just really aligning each interest groups on both sides, both the public and private sides or civil society side, to be able to align, and ensure that that partnership can be sustainable and it also functionally works, going forward. It's a very complex matrix that is being exposed, and as the conversation continues to improve and the PPP space evolves from just hard infrastructure, we're looking at now, very much, the social infrastructure that has the healthcare and all the other elements of education and other interventions that are, more, impactful to the societies. So these are, some of the framings that I know that, policy advocacy needs to be, aligned to very clearly and specifically, in terms of just generally also kind of connecting, with the SDGs, as we mentioned earlier. Can we move on? And in this cluster, obviously the impact level is saying whatever interventions regarding policy and the advocacy the private sector needs to focus on has, within the policy advocacy space as objectives, an impact directly in either in infrastructure, in the production space, within the community, or as, a people. There's a direct impact on that, right, in terms of just where your framing would be directly aligned to, right? So that clarity, I think, on the private sector side, in seeing how the governance structure from the public side is kind of framed and kind of structured, and how, our, how would I put it? Our common interest, is clearly kind of advocated towards, the similar language and conversation that needs to happen. These are kind of some of the clusters that at the end of the day would generally be impacted within the ecosystem, as either infrastructure or either it's improving production or is either, impacting on people. So this model here kind of just gives us a holistic flow, as I've tried to put it. I put, in terms of where, each community as a cluster, what input or what responsibility that they need to play that would generally bring, meaningful results, right, to move the needle forward in terms of this, our shared prosperity and development that we all aspire for, right? Political will is very important, as, no matter how the institutions and the public sector is framed, somehow, the power that, dictates, the flow of, where policies are directed towards has to do with, the political class. And hence, it's very important that, okay, for us to succeed, we have that focus around, the political class being the main drivers in terms of political will. Committed civil service. Obviously, there's a lot of capacity development that I think policy advocacy also can look into from the private sector, in terms of, because these are the institutions that should be able to mature, that independent of the political flows and political cycles, those institutions are really what needs to carry us forward regarding these long-term, PPP commitments and, execution. Right. So I think policy frameworks need to also, policy advocacy needs to also focus a bit on, how to improve and develop, its advocacy towards, improving that structure or institution. I'll jump, obviously, the other aspects, creating an enabling environment is a no-brainer. The arrow is there pointing at, how the community and, projects or interventions or programs from a policy standpoint are, adopted or accepted, generally. And that, especially even in the PPP space, which is called generally stakeholder engagement, is a very, very critical stage. And I think advocacy or policy or people within this community that I'm speaking to have a significant role, because in the interventions and the work that you do, there's a lot of rich data and intelligence and, of course, proximity that you have to these communities. And I think even for us as agencies, your kind of communities that is very instrumental, that as these general programs for development are being framed and developed, that there's a proper alignment, to how the interest and the stakeholder engagement and communication also happens at that level. So that alignment is very critical. And of course, I think, with that as it sits in the middle, is either, that works or, the cookie crumbles, as they say, on both sides, no matter whatever effort we started initially or what can happen after that. So you play a very critical role, because you sit very close, to where that data is most importantly needed for visibility. Next slide. And just because of time, so the case study I would also want to give as an example for a private sector private sector business that I've seen is kind of also delivering in the policy advocacy space using such initiatives, which I know a lot of you, the NGO communities and all that, also develop. And this reports and data is necessarily approached. So I think having a frame where as they say, data is the new currency, right? So because of the proximity of the especially the advocacy groups, that the proximity to the the communities that they serve, I think it's very, very critical that they look at an empowering position that they play, where the data they have is used strategically and resourcefully to be able to kind of frame the conversation, as you had it, like tell the story in one of your sessions, I think, the storytelling session. And with that, it helps align with the bigger conversation in terms of which policies that need to be generally focused on, which ones resources are available towards interventions and the likes, and how impactful that it can also be measured and monitored over time, right? So this is an organization that I think has done exceptionally well in bringing up, let's say, something like this report. The full report is there. This is just an overview of just how they've used that data that they've generated from the grassroots level and brought it into now bringing it into the conversation from the framing of how the public side policy for partnership opportunities, intervention or development agendas. And we, as somehow like the agency, would look for interest groups and different stakeholders that we can all bring to the table to address the pressing needs regarding what was presented as a healthcare challenge, in Nigeria. And so with this kind of, they've been able to go around states, they've been able to go around, the agencies that are relevant, understanding that these institutions can help, align all the different interest groups to be able to kind of see what role each and every party needs to play to be able to address the significant problems at the forefront. And then another example, I think I haven't, so this is a summary of, just like I said, with what in the report, this is an extract from inside the report, and the needs that they will be able to make clear within that. And, presenting that, we will engage the Ministry of Health, would align their data with where we are, and based on that, it will be easier and to get clarity on what next steps. And then because they are a private sector entity that also are involved in the sustainable healthcare financing and all that, they're also providing solutions directly, so I think policy advocacy institutions and also all that also need to identify keenly, those private institutions, be it profit-driven, that are aligned with certain interventions that would be clear as a holistic solution for how we can move forward. Another example that I'll give that is not here is that for us, even as a state, what we did as an agency was saying, we were able to invite and create what they call a technical committee. And a technical committee, with the agency being like the middle party, mediating, we were able to get all the pull out all the policies of, past and present of our government in that sense within Plateau State. And then we were able to get from different sectors, all sectors pretty much, stakeholders or interest groups and associations that we called into the Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. We lost
Oh,
you at
sorry.
some point. Yeah.
Yeah, it went off. So sorry about that. Yeah, so I was saying an example that we also did as an agency within the state was to be able to call up, all the interest groups based on different sectors, associations, and all that, to be able to get them to kind of give a comprehensive report on what they felt, the policies should be focused towards, where they felt policies that were kind of shortcoming or shortchanging their own, progress within their own space and all that. So that alignment also, I think, is very critical in terms of being able to bring, this conversation to, to a more meaningful place where I think, each entity within the ecosystem should be able to positively move forward to, kind of move the needle towards development, sustainability, and the likes. I just try to cut short on the, the very tight timeline in terms of this, but, this is, I guess, the vision that we're hoping a PPP kind of proposes, right? That we just transition, from developing to developed in whatever way. I think this image just to kind of reflect what is possible using partnerships as a model for engagement, both at the public and private side, and especially also, from the philanthropic space or NGO space. I think the key resources like data that I mentioned earlier on that plays a key role in, giving this clear context of what is needed as a way forward. Thank you. And I hope that at least within this short time, I've been able to kind of, give some context to what my thoughts are, what I think is happening in this space. And it will be interesting to just, get some feedback in terms of insights, questions, and I think we'll be able to shed more light. Thank you so much for having me. It's a great privilege, and I really appreciate this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Felix. That's been very rich and deep. So for someone like me who had not been, did not know so much about the private a public-private partnership and philanthropy space. I think I'm beginning to, I would ordinarily pass as a consultant after today. You know, thank you so much for your rich insights. We'll have questions from the audience, but I would like to invite Mr. Majid and Mr. Felix, please. We'll bring you back into a panel and we'll advance the conversation from there. Mr. Majid, if you're in the room, would like to say welcome. Please turn on your video and your audio and join us, please. Thank you so much, Mr. Felix. Uh, that was quite rich and extensive. Mr.
Mr.
Majid,
Henry,
good morning. Yes,
good
please, we
morning.
can hear
Good to
you,
see you again.
but we can't see your face.
Okay, maybe I will show my face briefly.
We would like to see your face because you'll be on the panel.
Okay,
Thank
let
you.
me
Good
get
to
to
see
the
you,
better
Majid.
position.
Yeah.
No wahala.
All right. So you are going to join us in this conversation. And I think Mr. Felix has been speaking for quite a long time. So maybe we should give him a breather and hear from you for a few seconds. Then we'll ask the questions we have for Mr. Felix.
Okay, thank you very
Yeah.
much. I think the presentation is not just rich, but it is very enriching of the subject matter under focus. In fact, as one of the panelists, I must confess that he has broadened my own perspective about the instrumentality of PPP in not just in advocacy, but even productive engagement with government and non-governmental institutions. And I must thank him very, very well and very much too for doing such a wonderful job. I was practically glued to his slides and his presentations, and it was well delivered in very simple language. And I'm sure the audience would have learned so much from it. Now, on the issue of private sector as agents of change in terms of advocacy for a whole range of issues that borders our world currently, I think it provided a very, very solid foundation for such engagements and why we should even have more of private sector engagement that is not embellished by politics or partisan considerations. I said this because at the end of the day, private sector, which includes, of course, NGOs, are critical stakeholders in the society. And they are best positioned to bring about altruistic agenda setting initiatives that can be advocated for to combat issues such as climate change, such as gender rights, such as poverty eradication, social justice and equity, and all of the ingredients that are required to make our world better. And so I think more focus and more encouragement should be provided for such very, very engaging conversations, particularly as it concerns public, private, and like he also added, philanthropic partnerships, which is the quadruple P now. We used to know PPP, but we now have
Yeah.
PPP. That was a new perspective that I didn't quite see coming. So I think my general impression of his presentation is quite excellent, and I hope that we can have a lot of takeaways from here going forward. Thank you
All
very
right.
much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Majid. I'm going to ask you another question before I go to Mr. Felix. So, uh, given the nature, Mr. Felix mentioned something about political mobility, if I use that word. Governments change, political actors change, appointees may leave office. So we need institutions, we need strong institutions to be able to drive policy change. But let's assume that given the nature of our engagements, mainly from the NGO world, our focus has always been on government actors and government institutions in trying to drive policy changes. Are there basic steps we can begin to take now as individuals? Are there some private sector actors, individuals or groups that we can approach? And how can we approach these people outside the government space in driving policy changes? You have the best of both worlds. You work with private organizations, you're very critical about government. So if we look away from actors in the government space, are there some persons or groups that we can look up to that can help us move the needle if we are looking to change the policy landscape in Nigeria, for instance?
It is practically impossible to do or achieve any form of policy change around any subject matter without government approval or government imprimatur. It's practically impossible. And that is why we must begin to reassess and redefine what government means. I think in our climate, we have come to see government as an anathema to development, an anathema to progress. And so sometimes it's cumbersome getting those who are supposed to be advocates and activists trying to get government to do the right thing. So it becomes like a tussle of some sort. So government is reluctant to do that, which is within its own constitutional mandate to do. So it creates a situation where we are beginning to think, is there a way we can do without an unwilling, a reluctant kind of government? But the answer is that it's not possible. So what I think we should begin to do going forward is, I don't think the NGOs, organized private sector especially, particularly the corporate world, can afford to stay aloof when it comes to partisan politics anymore. I say this because we must begin to aggregate collective interests around environmental, security, social issues, and mainstream them in political organization that can bet the right political leadership that will now implement some of these advocated policies as a matter of political party ideology. I think that is the next stage, and it's consistent with liberal democracy. The ethos of liberal democracy is such that party structures ordinarily are supposed to be structured along socioeconomic groupings rather than ethnic and religious groupings, as is the case in Nigeria, for example. So I think the next step is we must understand that government is something we cannot do without. And so we now have to part of that government by organizing properly. So some of the areas of interest, if it's environment, if it is gender rights, whatever it is that are areas of interest that we think will impact positively on the socioeconomic well-being of Nigeria and Nigerians, we must now begin to take a more than just a personal interest in politics and become active participants so that if we're able to bet political leadership arising from a social contract that was entered into with the people on the basis of these advocated policies, it becomes mainstream, it begins to drive government processes from the first day in office, and it makes it easier, especially when people see the impact of such implementations of these advocacies. People now begin to subscribe more to it. And Nigeria is a federating unit. And so we can start small. You must not win a general election at your first attempt. You can start from the urban areas, from specific areas where you have an enlightened population that can easily subscribe to a pragmatic form of politics that is broad-based in terms of its ideals. These ideas also are supposed to be aggregates of advocacies along some of these lines we'll be talking about. I think that is the most sustainable way. To put it simply, we must step out from the sidelines into the arena, and we have 3 or 4 years or so before the next general election. We must be active participants as it is done in other places. So you look at the United States, for example, you have climate change advocates aligning with certain political parties that embody their ideals about climate change, for example, or environmental concerns. We have the NRA that believes that the Second Amendment should be sacrosanct and people should have right to bear arms as a security measure against people that want to take away their lives and properties, aligning with the Republican Party. We need to do the same in Nigeria so that we begin to impact positively and effectively on government policies right from the recruitment of the leadership stage, which is the political process. Because government is something we cannot do without. It is inevitable. So we must make it better and make it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Majid. That's your insight is quite very rich. So if I got that correctly, just a way to summarize it, you were saying that for those of us who are working in the policy advocacy space as NGOs, we should not just be looking at the policy the things we are the changes we want to see, we shouldn't just be looking at them as policy asks, things we are proposing. They should be things that form the basis for which governments are established, or which political parties are established, so that once we have this ideology mainstream, then it's easier to achieve those results rather than just coming cap in hand asking that we want these things to be done. I think that's a very rich insight. Thank you so much. Mr. Felix, I would like to ask, please. You have given us a broad framework about the PPPP, right? Uh, so for those of us in the NGO space, for instance, many times we have funding agencies, and like you had mentioned outrightly, with the impact of COVID, with climate change, with global unrest, the focus of funding for development projects is changing. And so the PPPP framework is useful to sustain some of these developmental asks. Uh, Funding agencies would usually give out notifications, what we call notice of funding, right? They give out calls to say, oh, we have $200,000, we have $1 million, and we want to invest this $1 million in gender rights, for instance, or in environmental sanitation, in WASH, in the healthcare sector, and we ask you to apply for these funds. People come. Given the PPP framework and the nature of this engagement, how do we, who are on the other side, how do we know when to approach these institutions or these frameworks or these uh, pathways to support our own indigenous and local engagement? Is there a way we can know when to get to a group? Like, for instance, now you are the chairman of a group in Africa. Many persons may not even know about that agency existing. So how do we get to share knowledge about the existence of these frameworks and these movements, and know how we can align our own programs to it?
Okay. Yeah, I think one of the very important acknowledgements that we need to have is to understand that things are changing and have changed, right? From the previous approaches or models that have been adopted in the past, right? And I think the COVID was kind of a global reset, right? The world stopped for a minute and everybody reflected on, how we used to do things and where we want to going forward, right? So especially for us in Africa and especially in your space, the interventions from donor agencies and the likes, we've seen, and even not just, from the donor community, but even in the general PPP financing space, right? That Africa is not a global priority in the scheme of things. We need to accept and realize that. And that's part of where we said there's the national, regional shift more towards Pan-African mindsets, right? That people have come to the acknowledgement that, how do we start seeing how within us, we need to be able to kind of empower ourselves, right? As Majid rightfully said, alignment with certain interest groups is very, very key and very important. So you have, when you talk about financing now, you see climate change is this. So there's billions of dollars out there for climate type things. But even in that global space, they're still trying to define what does that mean really, right? And how do we, understand what is practical or not, and all that. So in the local, opportunity space, I think for existing institutions, the private sector, locally, there's some of them that have, interventions, the MTNs and the likes in terms of NGOs, our foundations, let's put it like that have certain, programs and projects. But those are, I think, some of, instrumental ways that we need to rethink of how do we create mutual value, in my own take, right? That what do I have? And I think from the NGO space, like I said, you're closer to the community. So the rich data, which is live and is as close as it could get, is what is missing usually at the other clusters. So how can you, and that's part of why I presented this case study from this fixing healthcare in Nigeria, because I think that was a good way of using that rich data to showcase value that, you know, the private sector can say, okay, you know what, if I intervene in this aspect, right, then I can get a tax waiver. We're already seeing it with the Dangote and all that doing roads for tax credit. And all, you know, so there's all sorts of this is so models that are more flexible, because at the end of the day, I think the objective is to get results, right? And even at the political level, I'm saying the constraints within the public sector is what is opening up the opportunity for the conversation, right? Because there are cash constraints, right? Yeah. If resources right now are pretty much to handle, you know, payment of salaries, then it means even from a political standpoint, there's nothing much I can do. So I need that private sector initiative and ideas. Who do I partner with? Who can, do you understand, who is ready, that given my life cycle of a 4-year spectrum can hit the ground running? And so that's the preparedness, I think, that is presenting a significant opportunity for the private sector to start thinking and positioning. And like I said, as Majid alluded, aligning to political interests or parties or whatever that are specific, you know, and it's definitely a must-have going forward.
Thank you so much. I like the fact that you had mentioned that we must think of creating mutual value. I think that stands out seriously for us. So for those of us on this other side, what values are we bringing to the table? So that if those values we carry align with what the frameworks or the movements have, then it becomes easier for us to become collaborators in that sense. We have a few questions from the participants. I would like to just take a few of them quickly. So someone had asked, what are the tools or strategies for effective communication with policymakers? Majid, would you like to answer that, please?
So what was the question again?
Policymakers, what are there some tools or strategies for effective communication with policymakers?
Yes, we made, I don't know how to put it. That's what is called lobbyists in some other jurisdictions, people that can tie the political interest of policymakers to a proposed or an advocated policy. But you have to tie it so that they see the benefit of this policy to their political interest. For example, the Not Young to Run bill was passed into law because at that time there was a need to appeal to the youth base in Nigeria. In and around the period you had the NSAS protests. So there was this, okay, an attempt by the politicians to say, look, we cannot continue to alienate the youth population of our country, so we need to do something which was tokenist. And so the Not Young to Run bill came in a bit handy towards that. So we have to intensify some of these kind of mechanisms, but you must tie it to their political interest. But beyond this, again, in the long run and for a more sustainable instrument of getting the right policies enacted and implemented, we still have to be mainstreaming this through the political process, because it all boils down to politics, really. If we succeed over time to make politics now rest on pragmatic issues such as environmental concerns, human rights, poverty, and all other altruistic agenda for national development. But then you mainstream it and make it the basis for political interactions, the basis for political transactions, it might be more effective. So what we'll now be dealing with going forward is alternative views and opinions on how to make things better. So all the same, it's important to tie the political interests of policymakers into any advocacy we are doing. Otherwise, it might meet a brick wall. So we need to work more on that, in that direction.
Thank you so much, Mr. Majid. Mr. Felix, please. Ademola is asking, why is it that PPP is more often about infrastructure, right? While other aspects of it that you have listed, so he mentioned that you have listed some other aspects that are not necessarily infrastructure, but that he thinks that attention is more on infrastructure when PPP is mentioned. And Ademola is equally asking, why is there so much reluctance about PPP in the power sector? So he has got two questions, right? And he's giving a case study of Plateau State where NESCO has worked very well. So he's asking, should there be so much attention to infrastructure and what is happening with the power sector in Nigeria?
Okay, so like in the presentation earlier on, in terms of how the PPP kind of has evolved from, the 1999 to where we are today. So obviously the initial conversation was hard bent on infrastructure. So in terms of models, frameworks, legal, and all sorts of design methodologies that are adopted for PPP has been skewed, towards infrastructure, right? So the evolution now in terms of what is most pressing needs that are happening, and this is at the global level, regarding social. So there's a lot of now social and all that, healthcare, water, all these other elements that are not hard infrastructure and all that are coming into the mix. But let's say the literature and the expertise in these are still new, are still developing, right? And one of the things I've even come to understand and we need to also appreciate, which is part of the conversation in the African space, is how to make these frameworks and models a bit adaptable, right? Because in the past, what has happened for climates like ours or climes like ours is the copy paste, right? Is the Western world is saying this is what PPP is, this is how it's designed, this is how it's developed. We copy and paste, and our realities are completely conflicting with that. So as models, it's evolving, and based on the pressing needs for development and where we are today, there's the inner conversation, and that's part of where the Africa PPP network and the likes of the Africa chapter in the World Association of PPP, these are things now that are being looked into to say, how do we adapt these frameworks, particularly for Africa. The South Americas, for instance, have been doing PPPs for 30 years and all that, but their literature and models and all that are foreign, are alien, is not documented. Do you understand? You have Asia that are doing their own and all that. So we've been skewed towards only the Anglo-Saxon space, and that has also brought its own limitations. So these are, new models that, we're questioning, and we're beginning to see how we can, make it practical and realistic. Power, obviously, you've seen, the devolution of the central or the federal law that now empowers states to, to control their power narrative going forward. NESCO, to correct you, is not a PPP model. And so, NESCO is a private company, but the state, as Plateau State, owns, a reasonable share in that company, but it's pretty much operating as a private entity, right? So the state also, so what you have as state-owned enterprises, right? So states can also own shares in companies as a way of generating revenue for the states, right? So that's the model of NESCO. Probably when it initially started, it was a PPP. I'm not too sure about that, but as the structure is currently, it's pretty much a state-owned enterprise. It's not even a state-owned enterprise, but it just, the state has shares in it. But I think there's a lot of PPP initiatives in the power space. There's a lot of funding, financing, because that is fundamental for any development of any community.
Thank you so much, Mr. Felix. Majid, Aisha too is asking a question. She's concerned that given what you have proposed, that NGOs should align with political parties during political recruitment process to mainstream their agenda and consent. She's asking, would this not make NGOs look like they are partisan?
There's nothing wrong with being partisan at all. Politics is a very good thing, but it has been made ugly and bad in Nigeria because of the way we practice it, the culture of politics in Nigeria. A leadership recruitment process is something that everybody must be interested in. You must be interested in how your environment is managed, how your constitution is operated, how your security is managed, how your economy is managed. You must be interested. And so economic interest groups and other NGOs that are advocating for a better deal for the people should simply engage on the basis of the advocacy. That is, if a particular political party agrees to say, look, I'm going to implement this. For example, the 35% affirmative action for gender inclusion, for instance, a party tells you, look, on the basis of a social contract with you and the people, I'm going to implement this. An NGO that is interested in that being implemented can also advocate for people to say, support this party for the purpose of this, if this is your interest. That is the essence of the party censorship.
Okay.
And it is done all over. It is global best practice in what you call liberal democracy. It is an integral part of it.
Right.
Now, it is because in the partisan politics means you come in, you win election at all costs, and begin to divide the spoils of war by way of appointment and inflated contracts. No. It is about good governance. It's a process towards good governance, which includes some of the ideals you're advocating for. There's nothing wrong with it. But I agree with her apprehension and her concern, but we must understand that there's a duty on all of us as citizens to reform our political process and bring it in conformity with international best practices, which includes, but not limited to, citizens' participation through collective engagement and bargaining.
Thank you so much, Majid. And you hinted on something concerning security. Benedict today had asked the question, and I think both Majid and Mr. Felix can speak to this. Is there anything that public-private partnership and philanthropy models is there any way this can help us solve some of our nagging security challenges in Nigeria?
Yeah, absolutely. There are frameworks for, PPPs in the security sector. There are different models that have been proven in other. I think the United States is predominant, in that, private contractors usually, especially for their international, interventions regarding security and all that, they use a lot of private organizations, so there are different models where, obviously, there's space for that. But it is about, problem solving, as we said. So it's about where the private sector understands that I can resolve, or I can help you address this problem, and this is how this partnership should be framed and worked upon. The alignment with the need of the public sector in terms of, how the citizenry are protected, how there's no exploitation or all the other elements that might come with that. So it's about seeking opportunity, and some people seek opportunity in the security space, right? And that alignment is always there.
All right, fantastic. Thank you very much for the enlightening presentation. Benedict again saying Nigeria is a developing country. What are the priority areas that CSOs can engage the private sector with at this time, to drive development in Nigeria? Are there priority areas you identify that you think that CSOs should begin to engage private partnerships with?
Is that for me?
Yeah, Ms. Felix, you can take that.
Okay. So in terms of our private sector, right, and institutions that are very active, right? Funny enough, if you look at it, really, we have very few, right? That you can say, if you kind of cluster our institutions or organize the big institutions, right? You have the banks, you have the industries, you have all that, right? So in identifying private sector, so you have the telcos, you have all that. So it's not as complex, right? So it's an aspect of saying, one, part of the advocacy is being able to promote where, as I think was alluded earlier on, the private sector also understands their role, right, within this ecosystem, that beyond just, the business environment is an aspect, that there's also a stake that or a commitment that is expected of them. I think that approach can be done. And a lot of these institutions also have their foundations and all that. So I think CSOs generally just need to be able to, like I said, it's mutual value. You need to be able to identify, what you are also bringing to the table that is beneficial to the mutual, to the partner that you're trying to kind of collaborate with, and find, finer points, right, where collectively, because it's about the collective. If that space and the private sector are engaging the political class, there's already that community that is within the same ecosystem that have a particular interest that's easy to be attended to, right? So these institutions usually do that. So you have the likes, let's put it like in Plateau State, you have NASCO. These are big industries. You have the big organized Grand Cereals and all that. So obviously, because of their impact economically within the community, there's the audience that they get. So NGOs and the likes need to be able to leverage such institutions and see, okay, where can we create mutual value for whatever policy elements that can, help, use them as part of that entry point. But I think there are different ways we can approach this.
All right, thank you so much. And we see most of the comments and reactions from many of you. Well, this Solomon had asked a question, but I think it's too pointed. We are not trying to discuss the current government. We are discussing in general how those of us who are outside government can actually push to make things better. Solomon is wondering why is it that there are no speedy actions going on now, But I think, Solomon, that's the reason we're having this conversation. And Majid had equally mentioned that we must look beyond just the political structure as it's currently constituted to see what we on our own can begin to do to drive the conversation away from the static nature of our politics to something that is more dynamic and more progressive. As somebody has equally asked whether reaching out to people in different parts of the world, especially Nigerians in diaspora, could constitute some kind of PPP to attract development. Would you want to say anything about that, please?
Absolutely, absolutely. If you look at because we're talking about where PPP, significantly where Africa sits, there's the financial requirements or support that is required. So FDIs, foreign direct investments, and other mediums of remittances are very, very critical. It was instrumental to India's development, where the global diaspora community and the amount of remittances back home was significant in terms of their own framing and development. So even with the Japa syndrome that's happening, there's going to be a counter positive that can come out from there, which is now those models. So what even as agencies like mine or some of the initiatives we're looking, because of course you have to identify the investment communities or the private sectors that you can first engage. And it's normally either those that are operating within that community, and then there's those that are also, the diaspora that have some form of stake. They're still stakeholders in as much as they are not, within the regional geography. So I would say, for instance, in Plateau State, I will reach out to, indigents that are across Nigeria or abroad that have, families interest in Plateau, right? That are, and that's the nature of where it is, that, there are frameworks that are being developed to see how, this can be a bit more aligned, and especially in terms of some of the projects or interventions that are being developed within the state, what we will do is to showcase to those communities. I know that some of the diaspora communities have some form of funds that they kind of put together in terms of, okay, funds for development, and it's targeted like that. So those conversations and awareness is ongoing, and definitely that is a source for development.
All right, thank you so much. Nafisa, we did not ignore your question. Nafisa was asking, thank you for the excellent presentation. Please, how can PPP help in the development of local women economy? I mean, how is our local government authorities keen into PPP to provide social services at the grassroots? I think the conversation mostly is not just about so there are different arms of government, and she's concerned whether the local governments are keen into PPP. If within your area, Nafisa, you think that your local government is really not keen into this, you have participated in this webinar now, you know that these initiatives are there and people can key into it. You can drive the conversation from that local perspective to make sure that your local government keys into it. So those of you, like Mr. Felix had said, there's a lot of data you have as NGO practitioners that help you drive your point home. So you can present these facts and figures before
So
those
let me,
who, yeah.
if I may just add to that. So at the local government stage, like I said, because PPP is still kind of generally a new concept that is still evolving and really maturing, and is guided by a law or a framework, right? That is a model, right? It's an alternative government procurement mechanism, right? That's really what a PPP is from a traditional standpoint. So even as states now that are becoming a bit more autonomous, is still kind of new. So not even all states still have, this as an entity, as a PPP agency, as a model for kind of collaborating these public-private partnership initiatives. So at the local level, it's also, it's still yet. So normally the local level is governed as it is now by the state laws or the state actors in that sense. So we work with local government chairmen and all that, to be able to understand, what initiatives or interventions they have in the PPP space. We've enlightened or did some bit of capacity building for them to appreciate that. But yes, one of the major challenges in the PPP space is still capacity in terms of, and this is at all levels, and this is globally, in terms of experience, expertise, both within the public sector and then even in the private sector, people understanding this new concept for partnerships and understanding the models for it to be actually successful to work, and so I hope that helps you some insights.
Thank you so much, Mr. Felix and Mr. Majid. Mr. Majid, would you do us a favor, just put on your camera just for 1 minute? Mrs. Honor, please, your camera will just take a group photograph. IT, can you spotlight Honor as well? Just very quickly. Mr. Majid, you didn't want to show us your beautiful office. All right, IT, let me know when you just take a quick picture from of the people on the panel. Thank you, all of you, for being part of it. Mr. Majirumas, thank you so much. We know how busy you have been. Thank you. Mr. Felix, you have been quite busy. We had pulled you out at this time. We hope this has been worth your time as well, sharing your experience and knowledge with other people. Want to thank all of you who have participated, but just before we leave, we would like to attempt another poll just to gauge from you what you have benefited from this session today. So IT, please, you could project the poll on the screen for us. And we ask all of you who have participated to please quickly just take the polls. All right, we would like to know what percentage of the knowledge you have gained today was completely new to you, right? Whether all of it was new or some part of it, we would like to know. How likely are you going to recommend this? Will this knowledge you have gained today help you in your advocacy engagement? Will it be very likely or not? And we'll equally like to know from you what you think about the speaker's presentation, whether it was excellent, and I think we just want uh, your perspectives, please. How likely are you to recommend our webinar to your colleagues? Because we'll have some other webinars coming. Would you like to recommend to your colleagues? Please rate your overall experience. And let us know, please, how you heard about this webinar. Was it from your colleagues? Was it from LinkedIn, from any newsletter? Where exactly did you hear this from? From WhatsApp? And if you have any other general comment, please feel free. Thank you so much. We are really grateful to all of you who had participated actively. Thank you again, Mr. Felix and Mr. Majid, for steering the conversations. We have been enriched, and I know that many of those who are listening have equally been enriched. I would like to yield the floor to Mrs. Honor, who is our Legal and Government Relations and Public Policy Team Lead at ACIOE. She'll be standing in on behalf of the uh, Managing Partner for ACIOE to give us a few words to close the session. Mrs.
Good
Honor.
afternoon. Yeah, good afternoon. It's really been a very enriching program. Thank you, the participants, for joining. Clearly, it was rewarding because your active participation showed that you really followed the topic. Mr. Majid and Mr. Felix, thank you so very much for the insightful presentation. Some quick takeaways for me. The new addition to the 3Ps that were all traditionally new us, PPP, private partnership. Now we've added philanthropy. Very good, because they have always been in the mix. So it's a good one. Clearly, when we're doing advocacy, we need to align our advocacy to the political will, what the government wants to do, because without them, we can't succeed. We thank you very much for highlighting that for us. Our advocacy should also include all the burning topics now, climate change, green technology, and all. And then key for me as well is the political angle to our advocacy. He gave example, Mr. Majid gave example of, take for instance, LGBTQ. I mean, they align with parties that will drive their agenda. NRA align with parties that drive their agenda. So I think we need to start being very deliberate about who we align with, even as the political space unfolds and we get more mature in our politics in Nigeria. I want to thank everybody. Mr. Majid, thank you so very much for taking out time for this webinar. Mr. Felix, thank you very much. Henry, thank you for being a very good moderator. And the participants, thank you for participating in this webinar. And we hope that for the next ones, you would also participate and then share the link with others, because I'm sure you were greatly, greatly enriched with this seminar. This is the 11th in our series, and we're going to do more next year. Thank you very much once again. And I wish you all a lovely holiday, a blessed Christmas. Enjoy your holidays. See you next year. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you.